Howdy, folks. I know I said that I might take a break between uh, finishing up the Heir to the Empire novel and moving into Dark Force Rising. But the fact is, I had such a good time doing it, and your guys' response was so great that I kind of wanted to jump up and get started right away. So, without blathering too much here at the beginning, let's jump into the real episode 8, Dark Force Rising, Chapter 1. Directly ahead, the star was a marble sized yellow orange ball, its intensity moderated by its distance and by the viewport's automatic sunscreens. Surrounding it and the ship itself were the stars, a spattering of blazing white pinpricks in the deep blackness of space. Directly beneath the ship, in the western part of the great northern forest of the planet Mercur, dawn was approaching. The last dawn that some in the forest would ever see. Standing at one side of the bridge viewports of the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera, Captain Pelion watched as the fuzzy Terminator line crept towards the target zone on the planet below. 10 minutes ago, the ground forces surrounding the target had reported themselves ready. The Chimera itself had been holding blockade position for nearly an hour. All that was missing now was the order to attack. Slowly, feeling almost furtive about it, Pelion turned his head a couple of centimeters to the side. Behind him, and to his right, Grand Admiral Thrawn was seated at his command station, his blue-skinned face expressionless, his glowing red eyes focused on the bank of status readouts wrapped around his chair. He hadn't spoken or moved from that position since the last of the ground forces had reported in, and Pelion could tell the bridge crew was beginning to get restless. For his own part, Pelion had long since stopped trying to second-guess Thrawn's actions. The fact that the late Emperor had seen fit to make Thrawn one of his 12 Grand Admirals was evidence of his own confidence in the man, all the more so given Thrawn's not entirely human heritage and the Emperor's well known prejudices in such matters. Moreover, in the years since Thrawn had taken command of the Chimera and had begun the task of rebuilding the Imperial fleet, Pelion had seen the Grand Admiral's military genius demonstrated time and again. Whatever his reason for holding off the attack, Pelion knew it was a good one. As slowly as he turned away, he turned back to the viewport, but his movements had apparently not gone unnoticed. A question, Captain. Thrawn's smoothly modulated voice cut through the low hum of bridge conversation. No, sir, Pelion assured him, turning again to face his superior. For a moment those glowing eyes studied him, and Pelion unconsciously braced himself for a reprimand, or worse. But Thrawn, as Pelion still had a tendency to forget, did not have the legendary and lethal temper that had been the hallmark of the Lord Darth Vader. You're perhaps wondering why we haven't yet attacked, the Grand Admiral suggested in that same courteous tone. Yes, sir, I was, Pelion admitted. All our forces appear to be in position. Our military forces are, yes, Thrawn agreed. But not the observers I sent into Hilliard City. Pelion blinked. Hilliard City? Yes. I find it unlikely that a man of Talon-Karrde's cunning would set up a base in the middle of a forest without also setting up security contacts with others outside the immediate area. Hilliard City is too far from Karrde's base for anyone there to directly witness our attack. Hence, any sudden flurries of activity in the city will imply the existence of a more subtle line of communication. From that, we'll be able to identify Karrde's contacts and put them under long-term surveillance. Eventually, they'll lead us to him. Yes, sir, Pelion said, feeling a frown crease his forehead. Then you're not expecting to take any of Karrde's own people alive. The Grand Admiral's smile turned brittle. On the contrary, I fully expect our forces to find an empty and abandoned base. Pelion threw a glance out the viewport at the partly lit planet below. In that case, sir, why are we attacking it? 3 reasons, Captain. First, even men like Talon-Karrde occasionally make mistakes. It could well be that in the rush to evacuate his base, he left some crucial bit of information behind. Second, as I've already mentioned, an attack on the base may lead us to his contacts in Hilliard City. And third, it provides our ground forces with some badly needed field experience. The glowing eyes bored into Pelian's face. Never forget, Captain, that our goal is no longer merely the pitiful rearguard harassment of the past 5 years. With Mount Tantus and our late Emperor's collection of Sparty cylinders in our hands, the initiative is once again ours. Very soon now, we'll begin the process of taking planets back for the rebellion. And for that, we'll need an army every bit as well trained as the officers and crew of the fleet. Understood, Admiral, Pelion said. Good. Thrawn lowered his gaze to his displays. It's time. Signal General Cavell that he may begin. Yes, sir, Pelion said, leaving the viewport and returning to his station. He gave the readouts a quick check and tapped his comm switch, peripherally aware as he did so that Thrawn had likewise activated his own comm. Some private message to his spies in Hilliard City? This is the Chimera, Pelion said. Launch the attack. Acknowledged, Chimera, General Cavell said into his helmet comlink, careful to keep the quiet scorn in his gut from getting in through to his voice. It was typical and disgustingly predictable. You scrambled around like mad hellions, got your troops and vehicles on the ground and set up, and then you stood around waiting for those strutting fleet people in their spotless uniforms and nice clean ships to finish sipping their tea and finally get around to letting you loose. Well, get yourselves comfortable, he thought sardonically in the direction of the Star Destroyer overhead, because whether Grand Admiral Thrawn was interested in real results or just a good rousing show, he was going to get his money's worth. Reaching to the board in front of him, he keyed for local command frequency. General Cavell to all units. We've got the light. Let's go. The acknowledgments came in, and with a shiver from the steel deck beneath him, the huge AT-AT walker was off, lumbering its deceptively awkward-looking way through the forest towards the encampment a kilometer away. Ahead of the AT-AT, occasionally visible through the armored transparasteel viewport, a pair of ATST scout walkers ran in twin-point formation, tracking along the AT-AT's path and watching for enemy positions or booby traps. Not that such futile gestures would do Card any good. Cavell had directed literally hundreds of assault campaigns in his years of Imperial service, and he knew full well the awesome capabilities of the fighting machines under his command. Beneath the viewport, the holographic tactical display was lit up like a decorative disc, the winking red, white, and green lights showing the positions of Cavell's circle of AT-ATs, ATSTs, and Hover Scout attack vehicles, all closing on Card's encampment in good order. Good, but not perfect. The north flank AT-AT and its support vehicles were lagging noticeably behind the rest of the armored noose. Unit 2, bring it up, he said into his comlink. Trying, sir, the voice came back, tinny and distant through the strange dampening effect of Merkur's metal-rich flora. We're encountering some thick vine clusters that are slowing down our scout walkers. Is it bothering your AT-AT any? No, sir, but I wanted to keep the flank together. Pattern coherence is a fine goal during Academy maneuvers, Major, Cavell cut him off, but not at the expense of an overall battle plan. If the ATSTs can't keep up, leave them behind. Yes, sir. Cavell broke the connection with a snort. The Grand Admiral was right about one thing, at least. His troops were going to need a lot more battle seasoning before they would be up to real Imperial standards. Still, the raw material was there. Even as he watched, the north flank reformed itself, with the hover scouts spreading forward to take up the ATST's former point positions, while the lagging ATSTs themselves fell back into rearguard deployment. The energy sensor beeped a proximity warning. They were coming up on the encampment. Status, he asked his crew. All weapons charged and ready, the gunner reported, his eyes on the targeting displays. No indications of resistance, active or passive, the driver added. Stay alert, Cavell ordered, keying for command frequency again. All units, move in. And with a final crash of mangled vegetation, the AT-AT broke through into the clearing. It was an impressive sight. From all four sides of the open area, in nearly perfect parade ground unison, the other three AT-ATs appeared from the forest cover in the pre-dawn gloom. The ATSTs and hover scouts clustered around their feet, quickly fanning out on all sides to encircle the darkened buildings. Cavell gave the sensors a quick but thorough check. 2 energy sources were still functioning, one in the central building, the other in one of the outer barracks-style structures. There was no evidence of operating sensors or of weapons or energy fields. The lifeform analyzer ran through its complicated algorithms and concluded that the outer buildings were devoid of life. The large main building, on the other hand. I'm getting approximately 20 lifeform readings from the main building, General, the number 4 AT-AT commander reported. All in the central section. They don't register as human, though, Cavell's driver murmured. Maybe they're being shielded, Cavell grunted, looking out the viewport. Still, no movement from the encampment. Let's find out. Assault squads, go! The hover scouts popped their aft hatchways, and from each came a squad of 8 soldiers, laser rifles held tautly across battle-armored chests as they dropped to the ground. Half of each squad took up backstop position, their rifles trained on the encampment from the partial cover of their hover scout, while the other half sprinted across the open ground to the outer line of buildings and sheds. There they assumed covering positions, allowing their comrades in the rear to similarly advance. It was a centuries-old military tactic, executed with the kind of squeamish determination that Cavell would have expected of green troops. Still, the raw material was definitely there. The soldiers continued their leapfrog approach to the main building, with small groups breaking off the main encirclement to check out each of the other's outer structures as they passed. The point men reached the central building. A brilliant flash lit up the forest as they blasted down the door, a slightly confused scramble as the rest of the troops piled through, and then silence. For a handful of minutes, the silence continued, punctuated only by occasional short commands from the troop commanders. Cavell listened, watching the sensors, and finally the report came through. General Cavell, this is Lieutenant Barse. We've secured the target zone, sir. There's no one here. Cavell nodded. Very good, Lieutenant. How does it look? Like they pulled out in a hurry, sir, the other said. They left a fair amount of stuff behind, but it all looks pretty much like junk. That'll be for the scanning crew to decide, Cavell told him. Any indication of booby traps or other unpleasant surprises? None at all, sir. Oh, and those life forms we picked up are nothing but those long, furry animals living on the trees growing up through the center of the roof. Cavell nodded again. Ysalamiri, he believed they were called. Thrawn had been making a big deal about the stupid creatures for a couple of months now, though what use they could possibly be to the war effort he couldn't guess. Eventually, he supposed, the fleet people would get around to letting him in on the big secret. Set up a defensive honeycomb, he ordered the lieutenant. Signal the scanning crews when you're ready, and get comfortable. The Grand Admiral wants this place taken apart, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Very good, General, the voice said, almost too faint to hear despite the heavy amplification and computer scrubbing. Proceed with the dismantling. Seated at the wild card's helm, Mara Jade half turned to face the man standing behind her. I suppose that's it then, she said. For a moment, Talon Card didn't seem to hear her. He just stood there, gazing through the viewport at the distant planet, a tiny bluish-white crescent shape visible around the jagged edge of the sun skimmer asteroid the wild card was snuggled up against. Mara was just about to repeat the comment when he stirred. Yes, he said, that calm voice showing no hint of the emotion he was obviously feeling. I suppose it is. Mara exchanged glances with Aves at the co-pilot station, then looked back up at Card. Shouldn't we be going, then? She prompted. Card took a deep breath. And as she watched him, Mara caught in his expression a glimmer of what the Merkur base had meant to him. More than just a base. It had been his home. With an effort, she suppressed the thought. Sakaar had lost his home. Big deal. She'd lost far more than that in her lifetime and had survived just fine. He'd get over it. I asked if we should get going. I heard you, Card said, the flicker of emotion vanishing again into that slightly sardonic facade of his. I think perhaps we ought to wait a little longer. See if we left anything behind that might point in the direction of our Rishi base. Mara looked at Aves again. We were pretty thorough, Aves said. I don't think there was any mention of Rishi anywhere except the main computer, and that left with the first group out. I agree, Card said. Are you willing to stake your life on that assessment? Aves' lip twitched. Not really. Nor am I. So we wait. What if they spot us? Mara persisted. Skulking behind asteroids is the oldest trick on the list. They won't spot us, Card was quietly positive. Actually, I doubt the possibility will even occur to them. The average man running from the likes of Grand Admiral Thrawn is unlikely to stop running until he's a good deal farther away than this. Are you willing to stake your life on that assessment? Mara thought sourly, but she kept the retort to herself. He was probably right. And anyway, if the Chimera or any of its TIE fighters started towards Wildcard, they would have no trouble punching the engines up to power and going to lightspeed well ahead of the attack. The logic and tactics seemed clean, but still, Mara could feel something nagging at the back of her mind. Something that didn't feel good about all this. Gritting her teeth, she adjusted the ship's sensors to their highest sensitivity and checked once more that the engine pre-start sequence was keyed in and ready, and then settled in to wait. The scanning crew was fast, efficient, and thorough, and it took them just over 30 minutes to come up completely dry. Well, so much for that. Hellion grimaced as he watched the negative reports scroll up his display. A good practice session for the ground forces, perhaps, but otherwise the whole exercise seemed to have been pretty useless. Unless your observers have picked up any reactions in Hilliard City, he added, turning to face Thrawn. The Grand Admiral's glowing red eyes were on his displays. There was a small twitch, as a matter of fact, he said. Cut off almost before it began, but I think the implications are clear. Well, that was something anyway. Yes, sir. Shall I have surveillance begin equipping a long-term ground team? Patience, Captain, Thrawn said. It may not be necessary, after all. Key for a mid-range scan and tell me what you see. Pelion swiveled back to his command board and tapped for the appropriate readout. There was Merkur itself, of course, and the standard TIE fighter defense cloud ranged around the Chimera. The only other object anywhere within mid-range distance. You mean that little asteroid out there? That's the one, Thrawn nodded. Nothing remarkable about it, is there? No, don't do a sensor focus, he added, almost before the thought of doing one had even occurred to Pelion. We wouldn't want to prematurely flush our quarry, would we? Our quarry, Pelion repeated, frowning at the sensor data again. The routine sensor scans that had been done of the asteroid 3 hours earlier had come up negative, and nothing could have sneaked up on it since then without being detected. With all due respect, sir, I don't see any indication that there's anything out there. I don't either, Thrawn agreed, but it's the only sizable cover available for nearly 10 million kilometers around Merkur. There's really no other place for Card to watch our operation from. Hellion pursed his lips. Your permission, Admiral, but I doubt Card is foolish enough to just sit around waiting for us to arrive. The glowing red eyes narrowed just a bit. You forget, Captain, he said softly, that I've met the man. More important, I've seen the sort of artwork he collects. He turned back to his displays. No, he's out there. I'm sure of it. Talon Card is not merely a smuggler, you see. Perhaps not even primarily a smuggler. His real love is not goods or money, but information. More than anything else in the galaxy, he craves knowledge. And the knowledge of what we have or have not found here is too valuable a gem for him to pass up. Hellion studied the Grand Admiral's profile. It was, in his opinion, a pretty tenuous leap of logic. But on the other hand, he'd seen too many similar leaps borne out to not take this one seriously. Shall I order a TIE fighter squadron to investigate, sir? As I said, Captain, patience, Thrawn said. Even in sensor stealth mode with all engines shut down, he'll have made sure he can power up an escape before any attack force could reach him. He smiled at Pelion. Or rather, any attack force from the Chimera. A stray memory clicked. Thrawn, reaching for his comm just as Pelion was giving the ground forces the order to attack. You sent a message to the rest of the fleet, he said, timing it against my attack order to mask the transmission. Thrawn's blue-black eyebrows lifted a fraction. Very good, Captain. Very good indeed. Pelion felt a touch of warmth on his cheeks. The Grand Admiral's compliments were few and far between. Thank you, sir. Thrawn nodded. More precisely, My message was to a single ship, the Constrainer. It will arrive in approximately 10 minutes, at which point his eyes glittered. We'll see just how accurate my reading of card has been. Over the wild card's bridge speakers, the reports from the scanning crew were beginning to taper off. Doesn't sound like they found anything, Aves commented. Like you said, we were thorough, Mara reminded him, hardly hearing her own words. The nameless thing nagging at the back of her mind seemed to be getting stronger. Can we get out of here now? She asked, turning to look at Card. He frowned down at her. Try to relax, Mara. They can't possibly know we're here. There's been no sensor focus probe with the asteroid, and without one, there's no way for them to detect this ship. Unless a Star Destroyer's sensors are better than you think, Mara retorted. We know all about their sensors, Ave soothed. Ease up, Mara. Card knows what he's doing. The wild card is probably the tightest sensor stealth mode this side of. He broke off as the bridge door opened behind them, and Mara turned just as Card's two pet Vornskers bounded into the room, dragging, very literally, their handler behind them. What are you doing here, Chin? Card asked. Sorry, Cap, Chin puffed, digging his heels into the deck and leaning back against the taut leashes. The effort was only partially successful. The predators were still pulling him slowly forward. I couldn't stop them. I thought maybe they wanted to see you, he? What's the matter with you two, anyway? Card chided the animals, squatting down in front of them. Don't you know we're busy? The Vornskers didn't look at him, didn't even seem to notice his presence for that matter. They continued staring straight ahead as if he wasn't even there, staring directly at Mara. Hey, Card said, reaching over to slap one of the animals lightly across the muzzle. I'm talking to you, Sturm. What's gotten into you, anyway? He glanced along their unblinking line of sight, paused for a second and longer look. Are you doing something, Mara? Mara shook her head, a cold shiver tingling up her back. She'd seen that look before on many of the wild Vornskers she'd run into during that long 3-day trek through the Merkur forest with Luke Skywalker. Except that those Vornsker stares hadn't been directed at her. They'd been reserved instead for Skywalker, usually just before they attacked him. That's Mara, Sturm, Card told the animal, speaking to it as if he might a child. Mara, come on now, you saw her all the time back home. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Sturm stopped his forward pull and turned his attention to his master. Mara, Card repeated, looking the Vornsker firmly in the eye. A friend. You hear that, Drang? He added, reaching over to grip the other Vornsker's muzzle. She's a friend. Understand? Drang seemed to consider that. Then, as reluctantly as Sturm had, he lowered his head and stopped pulling. That's better, Card said, scratching both Vornskers briefly behind their ears and standing up again. Better take 'em back down, Chin. Maybe walk them around the main hold. Give 'em some exercise. If I can find a clear track through all the stuff in there, he. Chin grunted, twitching back on the leashes. Come on, Littles. We go now. With only a slight hesitation, the two Vornskers allowed him to take them off the bridge. Card watched as the door shut behind them. I wonder what that was all about, he said, giving Mara a thoughtful look. I don't know, she told him, hearing the tightness in her voice. With the temporary distraction now gone, the strange dread she'd been feeling was back again in full force. She swiveled back to her board, half expecting to see a squadron of TIE fighters bearing down on them. But there was nothing. Only the Chimera, still sitting harmlessly out there in orbit around Merkur. No threat any of the wild card's instruments could detect, but the tingling was getting stronger and stronger. And suddenly she could sit still no longer. Reaching out to the control board, she keyed for engine pre-start. Mara! Aves yelped, jumping in his seat as if he'd been stung. What in. They're coming, Mara snarled back, hearing the strain of a half-dozen tangled emotions in her voice. The die was irrevocably cast. Her activation of the wild card's engines would have set sensors screaming all over to the Chimera. Now there was nowhere to go but out. She looked up at Card, suddenly afraid of what his expression might be saying. But he was just standing there looking down at her, a slightly quizzical frown on his face. They don't appear to be coming, he pointed out mildly. She shook her head, feeling the pleading in her eyes. You have to believe me, she said, uncomfortably aware that she didn't really believe it herself. They're getting ready to attack. I believe you, he said soothingly. Or perhaps he too recognized that there wasn't any other choice left. Aves, lightspeed calculation. Take the easiest course setting that's not anywhere towards Rishi. We'll stop and rest later. Card. Mara is second in command, Card cut him off. As such, she has the right and the duty to make important decisions. Yeah, but Aves stopped, the last word coming out pinched as he strangled it off. Yeah, he said, between clenched teeth. Throwing a glower at Mara, he turned to the nav computer and got to work. You might as well get us moving, Mara, Card continued, stepping over to the vacant communications chair and sitting down. Keep the asteroid between us and the Chimera as long as you can. Yes, sir, Mara said. Her tangle of emotions was starting to dissolve now, leaving a mixture of anger and profound embarrassment in its wake. She'd done it again. Listened to her inner feelings, tried to do things she knew full well she couldn't do, and in the process had once again wound up clutching the sharp end of the bayonet. And it was probably the last she'd hear of being Card's second in command, too. Command unity in front of Aves was one thing, but once they were out of here and he could get her alone, there was going to be hell to pay. She'd be lucky if he didn't bounce her out of his organization altogether. Jabbing viciously at her board, she swung the wild card around, turning its nose away from the asteroid and starting to drive towards deep space. And with a flicker of pseudo-motion, something big shot in from lightspeed, dropping neatly into normal space not 20 kilometers away. An Imperial interdictor cruiser. Aves yelped a startled-sounding curse. We got company, he barked. I see it, Card said, as cool as ever. But Mara could hear the tinge of surprise in his voice, too. What's our time to lightspeed? It'll be another minute, Aves said tautly. There's a lot of junk in the outer systems for the computer to work through. We have a race, then, Card said. Mara? Up to .73, she said, nursing as much power as she could out of the still sluggish engines. He was right. It was indeed going to be a race. With their 4 huge gravity wave generators capable of simulating planet-sized masses, interdictor cruisers were the Empire's weapon of choice for trapping an enemy ship in normal space, while TIE fighters pounded it into rubble. But coming in fresh out of Lightspeed itself, the interdictor would need another minute before it could power up those generators, if she could get the wild card out of range by then. More visitors, Aves announced. A couple squadrons of TIE fighters coming from the Chimera. We're up to .86 power, Mara reported. We'll be ready for lightspeed as soon as the nav computer gives me a course. Interdictor status? Grav generators are powering up, Aves said. On Mara's tactical display, a ghostly cone appeared, showing the area where the lightspeed dampening field would soon exist. She changed course slightly, aiming for the nearest edge, and risked a glance at the nav computer display. Almost ready. The hazy grav cone was rapidly becoming more substantial. The computer scope pinged. Mara wrapped her hand around the 3 hyperspace control levels at the front of the control board and pulled them gently towards her. The wild card shuddered slightly, and for a second it seemed that the interdictor had won their deadly race. Then abruptly, the stars outside burst into star lines. They'd made it. Aves heaved a sigh of relief as the star lines faded into the mottled sky of hyperspace. Talk about slicing the Minoc close to the hull. How do you suppose they tumbled that we were out there, anyway? No idea, Card said, his voice cool. Mara? I don't know either. Mara kept her eyes on her displays, not daring to look at either of them. Thrawn may have just been playing a hunch. He does that sometimes. Lucky for us, he's not the only one who gets hunches, Aves offered, his voice sounding a little strange. Nice going, Mara. Sorry I jumped on you. Yes, Card seconded. A very good job indeed. Thanks, Mara muttered, keeping her eyes on her control board and blinking back the tears that had suddenly come to her eyes. So it was back. She'd hoped fervently that her locating of Skywalker's X-Wing out in deep space had been an isolated event. A fluke. more his doing than hers. But no, it was all coming back as it had so many times before in the past 5 years. The hunches and sensory flickers, the urges and the compulsions, which meant that very soon now, the dreams would probably be starting again too. Angrily, she swiped at her eyes, and with an effort unclenched her jaw. It was a familiar enough pattern, but this time things were going to be different. Always before, there'd been nothing she could do about the voices and urges except to suffer through the cycle. To suffer, and to be ready to break out of whatever niche she'd managed to carve for herself when she finally betrayed herself to those around her. But she wasn't a serving girl in a floorless cantina this time, or a come-up flector for a swoop gang on Caproli, or even a hyperdrive mechanic stuck in the backwater of the Ison corridor. She was second in command to the most powerful smuggler in the galaxy, with the kind of resources and mobility she hadn't had since the death of the Emperor. The kind of resources that would let her find Luke Skywalker again and kill him. Maybe then the voices would stop. For a long minute, Thrawn stood at the bridge viewport, looking out at the distant asteroid and the now superfluous interdictor cruiser near it. It was, Pelion thought uneasily, almost the identical posture the Grand Admiral had assumed when Luke Skywalker had so recently escaped a similar trap. Holding his breath, Pelion stared at Thrawn's back, wondering if another of the Chimera's crewers were about to be executed for this failure. Thrawn turned around. "Interesting," he said, his voice conversational. "Did you note the sequence of events, Captain?" "Yes, sir," Pelion said cautiously. "The target was already powering up before the constrainer arrived." "Yes," Thrawn nodded. "And it implies one of three things. Either Card was about to leave anyway, or else he panicked for some reason." The red eyes glittered. "Or else he was somehow warned off." Pelion felt his back stiffen. "I hope you're not suggesting, sir, that one of our people tipped him." "No, of course not." Thrawn's lip twitched slightly. "Loyalties of your crewers aside, no one on the Chimera knew the constrainer was on its way, and no one on the constrainer could have sent any messages here without our detecting them." He stepped over to his command station and sat down, a thoughtful look on his face. "An interesting puzzle, Captain. One I'll have to give some thought to. In the meantime, we have more pressing matters. The task of acquiring new warships, for one. Have there been any recent responses to our invitation?" "Nothing particularly interesting, Admiral," Pelion said, pulling up the comm log and giving it a quick scan to refresh his memory. "8 of the 15 groups I contacted have expressed interest, though none were willing to commit themselves to anything specific. We're still waiting on the others." Thrawn nodded. "We'll give them a few weeks. If there's been no results after that time, we'll make the invitation a bit more compulsory." "Yes, sir," Pelion hesitated. "There's also been another communication from Yomark." Thrawn turned his glowing eyes on Pelion. "I would very much appreciate it, Captain," he said, biting off each word, "if you would try to make it clear to our exalted Jedi Master Sabaoth that if he persists in these communications, he's going to subvert the whole purpose of putting him on Yomark in the first place. If the rebels get even a hint of any connection between us, he can forget about Skywalker ever showing up there." "I have explained it to him, sir," Pelion grimaced. "Numerous times. His reply is always that Skywalker is going to show up, and then he demands to know when you're going to get around to delivering Skywalker's sister to him." For a long moment, Thrawn said nothing. "I suppose there'll be no shutting him up until he gets what he wants," he said at last. "Nor of getting any uncomplaining work out of him either." "Yes, he was grumbling about the attack coordination you've been having him do," Pelion nodded. "He's warned me several times that he can't predict exactly when Skywalker will arrive on Yomark." "And implied that a horrible retribution would fall upon us if he's not there when that happens," Thrawn growled. "Yes, I know the routine well, and I'm getting rather tired of it." He took a deep breath, let it out slowly. "Very well, Captain. The next time Sabaoth calls, you may inform him that the Tanab operation will be his last for the immediate future. Skywalker isn't likely to make it to Yomark for at least 2 more weeks. The little pot of political confusion we've stirred up in the Rebellion High Command should occupy him at least that long. As to Organa Solo and her unborn Jedi, you may also inform him that from now on I'll be taking a personal hand in that. Hellion threw a quick glance over his shoulder to where the Grand Admiral's bodyguard, Rook, stood silently near the aft bridge door. "Does this mean you'll be taking the Nogri off the job, sir?" he asked quietly. "Do you have a problem with that, Captain?" "No, sir. May I respectfully remind the Grand Admiral, though, that the Nogri have never liked leaving a mission uncompleted." "The Nogri are servants of the Empire," Thrawn countered coldly. "More to the point, they're loyal to me personally. They will do as they're told." He paused. "However, I'll take your concerns under advisement. At any rate, our task here at Merkur is completed. Order General Cavell to bring his force back up." "Yes, sir," Pelion said, signaling the communications officer to relay the message. "I'll want the General's report on file in 3 hours," Thrawn continued. 12 hours after that, I want his recommendations as to the 3 best infantry troopers and 2 best mechanized operators in the assault. Those 5 men will be transferred to the Mount Tantus operation and given immediate transport to Wayland." "Understood," Pelion nodded, dutifully logging the orders in Cavell's file. Such recommendations had been part of a standard Imperial procedure for several weeks now, ever since the Mount Tantus operation had begun in earnest. But Thrawn nevertheless still periodically went out of his way to mention it to his officers. Perhaps a not so subtle reminder of how vitally important those recommendations were to the Grand Admiral's sweeping plan to crush the rebellion. Thrawn looked out the viewport again at the planet beneath them. "And while we await the General's return, you'll contact surveillance regarding that long-term team for Hilliard City." He smiled. "It's a very large galaxy, Captain, but even a man like Talon Card can run for only so long. Eventually, he'll have to come to rest." It wasn't really deserving of its name, the High Castle of Yomark. Not in Joris Sabaoth's estimation, anyway. Short and dirty, its stonework ill-fitting in places and as alien as the long-gone race that had built it, it squatted uneasily between 2 of the larger crags on what was left of an ancient volcanic cone. Still, with the rest of the rim circling around in the distance, and the brilliant blue waters of Ring Lake 400 meters almost straight down beneath him, Sabaoth could allow that the natives had at least found some good scenery to build their castle on. Their castle, or temple, or whatever. It had been a good place for a Jedi Master to move into, if only because the colonists seemed to hold the place in awe. Then, too, the dark island that filled the center of the crater and gave the lake its ring shape provided a suitably hidden landing site for Thrawn's annoyingly endless stream of shuttles. But it was neither the scenery, nor the power, nor even the Empire that held Sabaoth's thoughts as he stood on the castle terrace and gazed down into Ring Lake. It was instead the strange flicker he'd just felt in the Force. He'd felt it before, this flicker, or at least he thought he had. Threads to the past were always so hard to follow, so easily lost in the mists and the hurryings of the present. Even of his own past he had only glimpses of memory, scenes as if from a history record. He rather thought he remembered someone trying to explain the reasons to him once, but the explanation was long gone in the darkness of the past. It didn't matter anyway. Memory wasn't important. Concentration wasn't important. His own past wasn't important. He could call upon the Force when he wanted to, and that was what was important. As long as he could do that, no one could ever hurt him or take away what he had. Except that Grand Admiral Thrawn had already taken it away. Hadn't he? Sabaoth looked around the terrace. Yes. Yes, this wasn't the home and city and world he'd chosen to mold and command as his own. This wasn't Wayland, which he'd wrested from the Dark Jedi whom the Emperor had set to guard his Mount Tantus storehouse. This was Yomark, where he was waiting for someone. He stroked his fingers through his long white beard, forcing himself to concentrate. He was waiting for Luke Skywalker. That was it. Luke Skywalker was going to come to him, and Luke Skywalker's sister and her as yet unborn twins, and he would turn all of them into his followers. Grand Admiral Thrawn had promised them to him in return for his help to the Empire. He winced at the thought. It was hard, this help that Grand Admiral Thrawn wanted. He had to concentrate hard to do what they wanted, to hold his thoughts and feelings closely in line, and for long periods at a time. On Wayland, he hadn't had to do anything like that. Not since he'd fought against the Emperor's Guardian. He smiled. It had been a grand battle, that fight against the Guardian. But even as he tried to remember it, the details skittered away like straws in the wind. It had been too long ago. Long ago. Like these flickers in the Force had been. Sabaoth's fingers slipped away from his beard, to the medallion nestled against the skin of his chest. Squeezing the warm metal against his palm, he fought against the mists of the past, trying to see beyond them. Yes. Yes, he was not mistaken. These same flickers had come 3 times before in the past few seasons. Had come, had stayed for a while, and then once again had gone dormant. Like someone who had learned how to utilize the Force for a time, but then somehow forgotten. He didn't understand it, but it was of no threat to him and so wasn't important. Above him, he could sense now the Imperial Star Destroyer entering high orbit, far above the clouds where none of the others on Yolmark would see it. When night fell, the shuttle would come, and they would take him off somewhere. To Nab, he thought, to help coordinate yet another of these multiple Imperial attacks. He wasn't looking forward to the effort and pain, but it would all be worth it when he had his Jedi. He would remake them in his own image, and they would be his servants and his followers all the days of their lives. And then, even Grand Admiral Thrawn would have to admit that he, Jorah Sabaoth, had found the true meaning of power. That's the end of the first chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you all soon.